Daja, how everybody? Let's get it on. Welcome once again to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution podcast with your host, Drew Smith, broadcasting from the ancient city of Xi'an. Glad to be back as always in the studio. Once again, had a crazy April. Lots been going on. Thankfully, I can report some good news. Students are doing well. Our fluffy mascot Ching Ching is out of the hospital and done with all of his treatments, so he is all better. And my partner and I are heading to Beijing in July, so we've booked our hotel room and our tickets. So that's going to be nice. Went to the Tongguan County Kite Festival these past 2 days and made some amazing new friends and saw some really amazing, beautiful kites. Kite flying and kite competitions go back a long time in Chinese culture, and to see that kind of stuff firsthand and take part in it and be in such a beautiful part of China that, Westerners rarely get to see. It was a good time. It was a good time. Unfortunately, my maternal grandfather passed away a few days ago, so back home in the States, we're dealing with that. But, rest in peace, Grandpa. I hope that, I'm making you proud here in China with what I'm doing. But, other than that, and May Day weekend is coming up, so happy International Workers' Day to everyone of the global proletariat and oppressed peoples, and everyone in the international communist movement. So, how about we end with the schmooze in there, and let's just get on with the killing. So, as I was saying last month, I wanted to start switching up the format of the podcast so that each month would alternate between a thematic episode and a chronological episode consisting of the story of 2 months of action at a time. Well, this month, we're doing just like I promised. We're doing sex and sexuality, love and marriage during the Cultural Revolution. So, sexual intercourse, marriage, dating, courtship, LGBTQ issues, we're going to try to cover as much as we can today. Yeah, sex, baby. It's how we procreate. It's how couples show they love each other. And to quote the great George Michael, who was a communist himself, sex is natural, sex is good. Not everybody does it, but everybody should. Sex is natural, sex is fun. Sex is best when it's one-on-one. Well, unless you're asexual, I got mad love for my ace comrades. You guys are valid, but for the rest of us, we all like making love. We all like making love. And the Cultural Revolution, was no different. No matter what period of history, no matter what culture, people fall in love and people make love. And, both Western anti-communist slander and a lot of the popular, albeit unofficial, as we will see, discourse during that period paint the Cultural Revolution as a time of massive sexual repression, where even sex for the purpose of procreation and showing affection between committed monogamous comrades was seen as counter-revolutionary and could lead to be struggled to death. I even once read this little pamphlet that a anarchist roommate I had in college had lying around. It was a so-called "quote unquote" sex positive pamphlet against Leninism, and it was from I think it was Crime Think, and it said that if Chinese youth were caught in bed together during the Cultural Revolution, they could be executed. And in the same pamphlet, it said that men who castrated themselves in order to remain celibate, to concentrate entirely upon fighting the class struggle against the capitalist roaders, were treated as great revolutionary heroes. I mean, here's the thing, guys. Considering how crazy Red August got and how zealous some people were to prove their loyalty to Chairman Mao during the 66 through 69 period, it's possible, but, it's Crime Think. And I'm sure that there was a lot of cherry picking, cutting the foot to fit the shoe, with the rare and most extreme outlying of evidence, if it was even true. Personally, in my further research that I've been doing the past, 2 or so months while getting ready for this episode, it seems that the reality was more somewhere in, it's a little more nuanced. That's true of everything with the Cultural Revolution. And while the Cultural Revolution was definitely not a time of sexual libertinism and queer positivity, as is common among many communists in the West today, to treat the Cultural Revolution as a, sexless, homophobic, completely Puritan society is just, it's a wee bit simplistic. So today, let's do a deep dive into what love, sex, dating, marriage, homosexuality, and other such issues looked like in Chinese society between 1966 and 1976. As well as, we'll definitely do a nice deep dive in the later half into homosexual and bisexual experiences during the Cultural Revolution, as well as the very, very little that we do know about trans and gender nonconforming folks that we can find in the historical record of the time, however scant it may be. So, snuggle up with your significant comrade, pour up some delicious Chinese jasmine green tea, which, according to Chinese traditional medicine, jasmine is an aphrodisiac. And let's dig into what sex and love were like during the Cultural Revolution. So, for starters, we need to understand this. We need to understand, and I am going to hammer this home multiple times across this episode, official state policy about sex during the Cultural Revolution was far from clear. I am going to reiterate that for everybody listening. Official state policy about sex during the Cultural Revolution was far from clear, be it the government or the party. There were no official laws about how people could and couldn't have sex or fall in love, and much of it was left for the masses to interpret the very vague or even straight up non-existent policies put out by Mao and the party center. And because of this, popular attitudes and behavior across those 10 years and across China were full of sharp and often very confusing contradictions. In many ways, the Cultural Revolution, while a time of egalitarian emancipation for the women of the world and a repudiation of traditional views of marriage, was still a time when the Chinese people held very conservative views on sex and marriage. One comrade reported that during his time as a sent-down youth, quote, "We were robbed of our youth, ideas, hopes, and love. In terms of love, people were criticized and struggled against, put into jail. All books about love were labeled pornographic. All songs about love labeled low class. Men and women in love were considered hoodlums, end quote. And yes, indeed, this is, I will say, everything I've read, premarital sex was very much still a big no-no in Chinese society at that time. Still kind of is today. Definitely there is a significant lack of Western-style hookup culture among Chinese youth. And it definitely wasn't one during the Cultural Revolution. According to Emily Honig's research, quote, the slightest suggestion of sexual interest was considered so ideologically unsound that gender taste in hairstyle and dress were considered coerced into a monotonous uniformity of shape and color, a kind of androgyny, a sexual sameness, based on the defeminization of female appearance and its approximation to male standards of dress, seemed to be the socialist ideal. And, you know, it's interesting because prior to 1966, that wasn't quite true. For one thing, during the 1950s, that's when the Chinese Supreme Court struck down the anti-sodomy laws of the imperial era and the republic era. Sex education and family planning resources were very easily accessible in China during the 50s, but when the Cultural Revolution came, class struggle against the capitalist roaders became the principal function of literally every aspect of society. And so that's when you see government-sanctioned booklets and manuals about feminine hygiene, marital relations, sexual health, sex education. They were completely pulled from publication, and any discussion of romantic relations were pulled from public discourse. One good example, in my opinion, to show just how, romantic love was pushed to the margins was the revolutionary model operas. If any of you guys have seen a lot of the revolutionary model operas, like The White-Haired Girl, The Red Detachment of Women, yada, 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 you'll notice that almost all the main characters seem to be single, or at the very least, their marital status is unclear. Everything was about the struggle and about liberation. No time to fall in love. And, this wasn't just limited to fiction, however. In mainstream press, for example, people never talked about party members' personal relationships. For example, Comrade Jiang Qing was never spoken, ever, of as Chairman Mao's wife or as the quote-unquote First Lady or anything like that. She was always just Chairman Mao's, quote, closest comrade in arms. And indeed, one thing that Honig points out is that many people, when they heard that Mao and Jiang Qing were married, they were very shocked or even refused to believe it. Now, again, let me reiterate. At no point was there any law or party-issued proclamation enacting enacting a prohibition of discussion of sex and romance. But among the general public, among the massive, there was a pervasive, unspoken, rule that getting any kind of romance novel or getting anything related to sexuality published, that was out of the question. I mean, you could sometimes get hand-copied volumes of Kama Sutra-style sex manuals, or maybe some pulp romance novels that circulated by hand within various literary circles, but even though you couldn't get arrested by the police for possession or distribution of those kinds of works, such things could get you criticized by your fellow citizens for taking part in things that were seen as, quote, selfish or, quote, distracting from the fight against the bourgeois reactionary line and the campaign to destroy the four olds. In short, it wasn't punishment by the state that young lovers feared. And indeed, frankly, from what I can tell, the party and the police, the state, couldn't really care less in most instances. It was more fear of attacks by colleagues, classmates, friends, fellow rebels, those kinds of things. It was the masses that you had to fear most when it came to repercussions of sexuality. And speaking of the four olds, you would think that attacking the four olds would have targeted ideas like female chastity, homophobia, etc., etc. Things that Maoists today work to struggle against. But instead, and for better or for worse, the Chinese people were concentrating mostly on attacking bourgeois culture. And they saw a lot of sexual culture at that time as bourgeois culture. Now, this might come across to modern revolutionaries as prudish or, puritanical even. But we should really put some things into perspective, guys. You have to understand that the aristocratic landlords and bourgeois classes of China during the imperial and republican eras conducted themselves in a very degenerate and libertine way. And this did breed an entirely understandable resentment among the common people, which they in turn counteracted with ideas of revolutionary sexual purity. For example, the Beijing number 26 high school Red Guards commanded all bookstores to destroy all porn and forbade telling dirty jokes or engaging in vulgar behavior on campuses. And I mean, I get that, destroying the porn industry and all that, but in pre-revolutionary China, you guys are thinking, well, why couldn't people tell dirty jokes or, hook up and things like that? Well, again, let's put something into perspective. The context is in pre-revolutionary China, dirty jokes were very popular among the upper class, as were orgies, swinger parties, things like that. Men having mistresses, emperors having concubines. Such things were seen as the milieu of the nobility and aristocracy, not of the proletariat and the peasantry. So, I'm sure a lot of you are saying, wow, the Cultural Revolution was a lot more conservative than I thought it would be. But surely, you say, a time like the Cultural Revolution where women's liberation was unprecedented, where women held a path of sky, would be a time when all ideas about sexism and misogyny would have been completely done away with, right? Gender practice during the Cultural Revolution was leaps and bounds better than the patriarchal society we live under today in modern-day imperialist capitalism, right? Well, I would say that for China, only 20 years after liberation. You guys got to remember, socialism was only established in the closing months of 1949, and the Cultural Revolution started in 1966. Okay? That's less than 20 years. And it was leaps and bounds better for people. But 5,000 years of tradition still weighed heavily on people's mind. And so I think that's why the gender practices of the Cultural Revolution would, in some respects, shock and disgust many communists in 2023. And I'm not just talking about the revolutionary sexual purity, I'm also talking about how there was a lot of rhetoric during the Cultural Revolution that was very degrading towards women. For example, sometimes women who were capitalist roaders were labeled during struggle sessions and on dazabaos as quote-unquote broken shoes, which in Chinese culture is a very degrading way of slut-shaming a woman. Essentially, it infers that your lady bits have been a bit loosened up, if you get what I'm saying. In fact, sometimes women would be paraded through the streets with worn shoes hanging from their necks as a misogynistic insult. It's kind of how insults and red pillars in these days refer to non-virgin women as quote-unquote roasties, pardon my French. I mean, heck, even Yan Wanzi and Jiang Qing were declared by their political enemies to be, quote, sluts and, quote, hookers, rough translations, when they were knocked down in 1968 and 1976 respectively. And even today, Nye and Jiang are still spoken of in very sexually crude ways by older Chinese men. And it wasn't just women that were targeted that way. At a grassroots level, many political attacks against male capitalist roaders were framed with the accusation of womanizing. Being a ladies' man, a player, a man whore, very risky things to do for the guys, and it would get you labeled a misogynist or a sex pest with a snap of one's fingers. And you guys know how misogynists got treated during the Cultural Revolution, and rightly so. So, to quote Michael Jackson, "Mama always told me, be careful what you do. Don't go around breaking young girls' hearts." But, another thing that intrigued me was how dating and courtship worked during the Cultural Revolution. According to a few old folks here in China who I've met, what they told me is, yes, people fell in love and married for love, yes, much more than they did prior to 1949. Yes. But there was still a lot of marriages that were semi-arranged. Albeit, instead of forced marriages set up by families, work units and communes, or if you were in the army or in the militia, your unit would match up young people looking to get married. Now, both parties had the right to turn one another down, unlike in the old society, so that was a big step forward. But still, the idea of traditional Chinese matchmaking was still very much the norm in the Cultural Revolution. Even though it was no longer done by your family, it was now done by your factory, your collective farm, your military regiment, your rebel faction. So I think that was kind of interesting. It was a step forward, but it was a lot more traditional than I thought it was. So, in summary of what I've just discussed, again, most sexual repression in China during the Cultural Revolution was not state or party sanctioned. Again, there was no decree by Mao or the party center prohibiting non-marital romance or casual sexual relations. And as Honig points out, the only way the party itself silenced sexuality and suppressed sexuality was through suppressing itself on sexual issues, which the broader masses were then able to interpret in any way that they wished. And among the masses, that came about as a conflation between sexual impurity and political impurity, and vice versa. Sexual purity meant political purity. But, my friends, people will be people. And there was another side to the Cultural Revolution. As you guys might remember in the early episodes, one of the most important parts of the early part of the Red Guard movement from July of 66 to February of 1967 was the revolutionary networking movement, where Red Guards traveled all across the country, linking up with each other and exchanging revolutionary experiences. As said before, the Cultural Revolution was the first time many youth were emancipated from parental control and got to leave home for extended periods of time. During these long travels across China for revolutionary networking, many young people fell in love and had sex across the way. You guys might remember I told you guys about how a lot of kids, lost their virginities on the green trains around, going around China. Yeah, if the green train cars are rocking, don't come a knocking. Oh my gosh, a bad joke. But yeah, no, seriously, many a young Red Guard girl ended up coming home pregnant from their trips to the Beijing Red Guard receptions. And, many a Red Guard came home, to their hometowns with a new partner in tow. For urban youth, however, the Down to the Countryside campaign after 68 represented the most important context for sex. Why, you might ask? Well, this is where things dialectically, one divides into two. Some scholars say that the traditional conservative morality of the peasantry was a major factor in how the frisky hormonal youth were treated in terms of being physically admonished and denounced for dating or hooking up. However, one thing you guys got to realize about Chinese rural areas is that while they can be very conservative in morals, in practice, they can be a lot more frisky than urbanites. I mean, if you think about it, when you live out in the countryside, sometimes the only thing you can do besides work is fuck. One example I read about was one sent down youth named Wang Yanyan. She was sent to Inner Mongolia when she was 16, and upon reporting to her production brigade leader that she saw a man and a woman fucking in a ditch, she was just laughed off and told it was nothing. That's just how peasants were, yo. They like busting cheeks. This is kind of funny, many young men from the urban areas were deflowered and made into men by local peasant women. And a lot of country girls, they couldn't resist some handsome young city boys ripe for the taking. Decided to get them done, you know what I'm saying? Hell, one commune in Sichuan had a small road outside of it that the local sent down youth called, and I'm not joking here, it was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a lover's lane where comrades would go to hook up with each other, and particularly sent down youth would go hook up with the peasants. It even got to the point that in some people's communes, unmarried men and women began to cohabitate with each other, something unimaginable in urban work units. Either way, despite the conservatism of the peasantry, Friday and Saturday nights on the people's communes during the Down to the Countryside campaign, it was supposedly, depending on the time and place, it was prime times for people to be working on their night moves. Okay, but seriously, there was one downside to all this bumping of uglies. And that's, the usual consequences. Pregnancy was actually a major issue among sent-down youth, and so there were a lot of abortions at the local women's health clinics during that time, which, it's really good that in revolutionary China, women had such easy and free access to such a procedure, unlike a certain number of places back home in my homeland of the USA. Looking at you, Texas. But even women who elected to not get abortions ended up giving their children to local peasant families to raise when it was time for them to return home to the cities. So in many places in rural China, there grew up, a generation of kids who were born to urban youth but raised by the peasantry and never knew about or got to meet their birth parents. But what about sex in the city? Surely people weren't just celibate in the urban areas. Well, oh yes, people were indeed doing their thing in the city. Indeed, many work units complained of liaisons on the job at factories between male and female workers, and sometimes it got to be such a problem there had to be mass meetings held by the revolutionary committees to tell people to cool their jets so they could concentrate on grasping revolution and promoting production rather than, grasping other things and producing other things. Sexual liaisons among Red Guards and rebel workers was, it happened among many factions. I read one story about how one woman ran into an old comrade of hers, a fellow woman Red Guard, many years after the Cultural Revolution, and her friend straight up asked her, "So how many boys did you sleep with during those years?" Now, while I'm not saying it was the norm, it does seem that there was a little bit of a nascent hookup culture among some Red Guard factions in certain times in certain places, even if the overall zeitgeist of the time was literally violently disapproving of such things. The Cultural Revolution, it was a time of experimenting. Lots of experimenting. Now that we've talked about heterosexual sex in the rural areas and urban areas during the Cultural Revolution, let's move on to a subject that I'm sure a lot of you have waited excitedly for me to address: queer sexuality and identities during the Cultural Revolution. Yup, that's right, folks. We're about to pour up a nice piping hot cup of that gay shit. Oh, baby. Well, okay, I hate to burst a lot of my comrades' bubbles, but this is where we hit a bit of a roadblock. Not all that much has been written about homosexuality, bisexuality, or transgender identity during the Cultural Revolution. In fact, I was only able to find 2 or 3 significant academic studies on the subject, and then a couple of scant mentions in the other sources I used across my research. Here, I tried the Shanxi Provincial Archives and the Northwest University Archives. They didn't turn up anything. Gender nonconforming and transgender people are almost entirely absent from the historical records so far, sadly. That isn't to say, obviously, that trans people didn't exist in China. I mean, trans people have been around since the beginning of time, just like anybody else. But in a country that only had begun to overthrow patriarchy less than 2 decades beforehand, like I said, just such matters just were not discussed. It wasn't on the table yet. Indeed, study of trans issues didn't really start becoming a thing in China until about the 90s. And even today, it's you don't want to be trans in China. It's not met with violent disapproval, but the social stigma, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. Trans people have it rough everywhere, but in China, it's still pretty darn rough. Still, We have a few testimonies of the presence of LGBTQ communities in China during the Cultural Revolution. So let's take a look at some of the things I did end up digging up in my studies. So, one woman interviewed by Chinese sociologist Li Yinhe said the first time she discovered the existence of lesbians was on a people's commune, where she met two fellow sent-down youth who were openly in love. It also seems that lesbian couples were reported among peasant women. Although, like I said, deeper discussion about lesbian love within rural China, it's still scant, it's still kind of developing, but we do know it happened. One thing that surprised me was that a group of about 100 male soldiers sent to the around, Heilongjiang province during the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969 admitted that homosexual relations happened among them and other PLA comrades of the time. And that makes me wonder if lesbian romances were happening among the female soldiers at the same time. Either way, we know that gay shit was going down within the PLA during the Sino-Soviet border conflict. Now, something we should take into account in our attempts to build a queer history of the Cultural Revolution is that the chaotic situations and dislocations of youth from their families due to the revolutionary networking campaigns of 66 and the Down to the Countryside movement of 69 provided young people, particularly gay men, with a remarkable degree of personal freedom and the opportunity to explore same-sex relations. Now, as we've well established in this episode, this was not a time of sexual liberty. Even when consensual sex between men was not deemed by the Chinese Supreme Court as a crime, local courts and police in both urban and rural areas acted on their own and pursued the punishment of gay men in very arbitrary manners. Indeed, while national level state policy about gay sex during this period is far from clear, and the Communist Party of China did not have an official line about homosexuality at all, and there's really no laws or policy imposed by the central government on the matter. Popular constructions of state policy were particularly antagonistic towards homosexuality. And, gays and lesbians were subject to very extra legal sanctions and vigilante justice by their fellow citizens. But I still found a few testimonies of gay men's lives during the Cultural Revolution that really piqued my interest, and I'd like to just read them off to you folks. One sent-down youth tells his story. Quote, "At the end of 1968, we were mobilized to the countryside and we were sent to a commune. The man who received us upon our arrival was my, quote, comrade friend later. He and I were both 17 years old. He and I were good friends for a long time. We cracked jokes, and we dared to talk about homosexuality after we were familiar with each other. He treated me with special regard. He loved to chat with me. And finally, one night, we had sex. After that, usually we slept with our arms around each other. Aw, that's cute. Young love. Beautiful. One teacher, Shi, who worked at the Ministry of Water Resources and Ministry of Electrical Power in Beijing during the Cultural Revolution, tells this story of his queer romance. Quote, during the Cultural Revolution, I had a boyfriend. We lived in the bachelor quarters of the workers' dormitories of our ministry, and ours was a twin room in Beijing. How did we get together? We were involved in the revolutionary networking. He and I were responsible for helping be the hosts for traveling Red Guards coming into town. He and I had sex quite regularly. We were all very free during the Cultural Revolution. He lived together with me. We squeezed under the same quilt. This was the first time I fell in love. Well, one comrade did not have such a good experience upon being found out to be in a casual hookup relationship with a fellow male Red Guard. As he tells it, at that time, I was arrested 4 times by my fellow Red Guards. They would also beat me. They'd say, "You son of a bitch, you are only worth kicking." They used a bar and stabbed me in the eye with a knife. The Red Guards beat me heavily. Generally, they would kick my body, my buttocks. They would hit me with a bar. Bang! Bang! When the pain began to ease, they came at me again. I'd be black and blue. They said there must be some relationship between my lover and I. They asked, which one of you was the top? Which one of you was the bottom? I dared not admit it. I dared not admit it at all. They asked, what's the relationship between you and him? If you confess, you would get leniency. But what's leniency? I dared not confess. End quote. So, it's very interesting to read these stories, both the positive ones and the negative ones. These men who were in their late teens and 20s at the time took part in everyday politics and struggle during the Cultural Revolution, while at the same time enjoying relationships with fellow men. The Cultural Revolution, as one scholar notes, quote, forms the bedrock through which gay men can tell their stories about sex with and love for other men, and in my opinion opens up the possibility for us to build a queer history of the Cultural Revolution that needs to be further explored. And, it's funny, while male-to-male intimacy in everyday life was perceived by young men as a demonstration of staying focused on Mao's revolution, like I said earlier, a lot of times heterosexual romance was interpreted as a sign of selfish desires. Many men who grew up during the Cultural Revolution did not have their first heterosexual experience until they were in their late 20s or early 30s during the Reform and opening up. But quite a number of them had same-sex relations during that time, although they would not identify as homosexual or even bisexual. Kang Wong-Ching, a scholar of East Asian queer studies at Cleveland State University, has interviewed a number of gay men who lived during the Cultural Revolution. He states in his report, and I'm quoting here, when I asked them if they felt repressed during the Cultural Revolution, their answer was unanimously negative. According to them, the Cultural Revolution period was a good time for sexual adventures. Everybody was busy with politics. Nobody cared about who was sleeping with who, one of them said. What that I found was if a man was found to have engaged in same-sex relations during this period, how he was treated greatly depended on the particular work unit he belonged to, and most importantly, on the person who happened to be in charge at the time, end quote. So, much like everything during the Cultural Revolution, it all comes down to the time, place, and who was involved as to what the prevailing attitude was or what the policy was about one thing or another. Regardless, what little research and documentation we have leaves us without a doubt. Dude Bros was busting cheeks on the download all across the Cultural Revolution, all across China. And the ladies, they were, getting on with other ladies too. Gay shit was going down. And it went down a lot. Before we wrap things up, y'all, I wanted to touch a little bit back on trans issues in China. Like I said, we really don't find transgender folks coming up in the historical record of the Cultural Revolution. Yet, at least. The field is always developing. But one thing I've heard from word of mouth, not in scholarly sources, so you guys are going to just have to take this at face value. This is just from what older folks have told me personally, is that sometimes in the old system, if a firstborn child was a daughter, they would raise their child as a boy, and for many of these children, they lived their lives as men. their entire lives as men. Sadly, even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, having your firstborn child being a boy was still highly prized and was a major birthmark of the old patriarchal society. Now, let me be clear. These individuals would not have used the term transgender or trans man or anything like that to describe themselves, nor would their parents describe them as such. But the fact of the matter is I have heard, via mainly hearsay, stories of people that we would call, quote-unquote, assigned female at birth, being forced by their parents to live their entire lives as their quote-unquote sons, and that's just how things were going to be. So, something interesting to chew on there, and definitely evidence that gender was not as always rigid as you would think in Chinese traditional society or during the Cultural Revolution. Alrighty, folks. Well, hope you enjoyed that relatively short but rather steamy episode. Next month, we're going to continue the chronological narration of the Cultural Revolution as we go into April and May of '67 as the Beijing Revolutionary Committee is founded, Hong Kong breaks out into widespread Maoist riots, and the entirety of China inches deeper into a nationwide Red Guard civil war. All right, like I said, everybody, May Day holiday is coming up. I think, let's see, what am I doing for May Day? No, these days we really don't have May Day parades in China anymore unless it's like, a special anniversary year, a special anniversary year like, in 2021 for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the party. May Day is very much like Labor Day in the U.S. So I know that Yukun and I are going to be going to the Dashingshan Temple, which is a really beautiful ancient Buddhist temple from the 3rd century. It's also the birthplace of Tantric Buddhism. We're going to the tomb of Qin Ershi, who was the 2nd emperor of China, the 1st emperor's son. His much smaller tomb, he didn't get any terracotta warriors. He wasn't exactly a particularly illustrious emperor. But yeah, there's a park in Chuzhong district that has his tomb, and it's supposedly quite lovely. And I've just, in the past 3 years of living here, never had the chance of going there. So we'll head there. There's also a Hans Christian Andersen illustrations exhibit that at the Xi'an Art Museum that we're going to go to. So yeah, that's what my International Workers' Day holiday will entail. And with that, let's see. No corrections corner. So yeah, I'll be also administering midterms to my students after May Day vacation, so I'll be a bit busy there. But overall, May 31st, watch out for episode 11, Chaos Under Heaven, April through May of 1967. This month's episode bibliography includes Women, the Family, and Peasant Revolution in China by K. Ann Johnson. Socialist Sex, The Cultural Revolution Revisited by Emily Honig. Never This Wild, Sexing the Cultural Revolution by Wendy Larson. Under the Same Quilt, The Paradoxes of Sex Between Men in the Cultural Revolution by Heather Worth. Male Same-Sex Relations in China by Kong Wen-Ching, and Sex in Mao's China, How a Foreign Barbarian Blushed by Richard Kirkby. All right, everybody, I'm going to head down to the canteen and get myself some wholesome Chinese grub. So, from the ancient city of Xi'an on this lovely spring day, I say Zaijian, Happy International Workers' Day, and see you next month.